Hey guys, welcome back to our t-shirt tutorial series here on Turbo 360. In the previous video, we set up the individual page for each t-shirt so that if a visitor wants to see more details about a specific shirt, additional screenshots and the price, and maybe buy it, they can do that on that individual page. In this video, we're going to actually connect the checkout flow on using PayPal so that people can actually buy shirts on your website if you want to support that functionality. You will need a PayPal account, so make sure you have that, and it does need to be a business account. Business accounts are free, but they just have more additional functionality for things like what we're about to set up in this video. So make sure you have that if you want to follow along and connect the actual payments flow in your t-shirt store in your project. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to run the local host and make sure everything still works the way it does at the end of the last video. So let's head over to localhost 3000. Everything here looks good. All the t-shirts are showing up from the CMS. Let's take a look at the individual shirt page. And this is what we set up in the last video. Great, so everything is still good to go. In this video, we're gonna remove this and replace it with the PayPal button and actually connect the PayPal flow. I'm going to do a little bit of reorganizing here just to make it a little bit easier a little bit less cluttered, and we will then set up the actual PayPal button here to check out. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn off the server, open up the shirt mustache template. I'm going to scroll down to the purchase button, this button right here. Let's go ahead and remove that. So that's this right here. I'm going to replace this with a div whose ID is PayPal button, and this is where the PayPal button is actually going to show up. So we're going to need this later. Here are the social media sharing icons. I'm going to remove this and place it up top near the title and the price. So the name and the price, I'm going to get rid of this and replace it with the social media sharing icons. And let's see how that looks. Okay, let's bring this up a little bit. That's probably a padding on that div. So we're going to want to do a padding top of 0. This is a bootstrap class, which gives us the ability to change the padding. That margin, let's make that over here on the price a margin bottom of 0 to group these two a little bit closer. I think maybe 1 is a better move here. Okay, so that's all set to go, and now let's set up the PayPal button down here, and that's going to be inside this div that we initially set up over here. But before we do that, like I said before, we're going to need an account on PayPal. So head over to developer.paypal.com. I'm already logged in, but if you don't have an account, go ahead and sign up, and then head over to your dashboard on your PayPal account. Click on that. And then over here in your developer dashboard on PayPal, on the left side, you'll see My Apps and Credentials. And right here, make sure you have Sandbox highlighted, otherwise it's going to be a production app. And create a Sandbox app. I already did this. It's called Shirt Shack in my case. And this is what we're going to need to process payments in the Sandbox environment, which is a completely fake environment where you can process as many charges as you want and it won't actually go through in real life. So it's a good way to experiment and test things out. So go ahead and do that. And when you do, you will be redirected to something like this, where we need our client ID and the client secret. So let's begin with the client ID. I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to move it over to my t-shirt store and create an environment variable out of it. So we want to go to the env file, which is our environment variable, and I'm going to create an environment variable called ppClientID and equals, and then the value from the PayPal dashboard. And then I'm going to create another one called ppClientSecret, and I'm going to head back here. The secret is right here. You want to just click on that and then copy it. And again, this is a completely fake account or a fake environment, so none of these are real. This is just for testing. And then we have our client ID and our client secret. And then if you head over here towards the sandbox and click on accounts, because this is a sandbox account, which is not real, we need to create basically fake accounts for the purposes of testing. These are non-real accounts that you create on the sandbox environment that you can use for testing on sandbox accounts as much as you want without actually incurring any real charges and doing anything real. So PayPal should set you up with two right out of the box. It'll set you up with what's called a facilitator account and then a buyer account. The facilitator account is the account that you use to accept payments. So this is basically your business account. And then the buyer account is what you use to test purchases. So this will be your quote unquote visitor, your customer. You can create as many more additional accounts as you want. So I've created a few additional ones here just for pure testing purposes. And each account can have a different amount of money, different source of funding. So if you want to try something where the user doesn't have enough money or the credit card gets declined, things of that sort, you can create different accounts for those purposes. So make sure you have the facilitator account and the buyer account. And I think PayPal automatically assigns a password. If you want to change that, you click on View or Edit, and then you want to head over to the password right here, and then you want to change that, and then that way you don't have to remember a weird password that PayPal gives you. Okay, so make sure you have all that set up, and then we can go back to our code and begin integrating the PayPal button. So we want to do that on the individual shirt page. If we scroll down to the bottom, actually I'm just going to collapse that. And beneath the scripts, what we need to do is import another script, which is going to be the PayPal JavaScript Sdk. So this is a text JavaScript import, and the source is the PayPal.com. It's the SDK, the JavaScript version, and we need to pass in the client ID as a URL request parameter right here. You can copy and paste the actual value right here, but what I normally do is I pass it in as a mustache template variable. So pp client ID like that. And then what that means is we have to go back to our route, this particular page, which is right here, and we need to pass in to the data the pp client ID, which is from the env variables, which is going to be this value right here. And that will pass it into your template like that. So make sure you have that properly set up. And then let's head over to our terminal. My server is already running, so we can just go ahead and test it by going back here and reloading the page. And let's see here. I'm going to reload, and I'm getting a client error. Oh, because I forgot to actually render the button. So we're actually not getting any errors here. Everything here is actually set to go, but I didn't actually render anything. So let's go ahead and do that. So we set up another script tag, which we're going to run on the page. And what we're going to do now is we're going to create a function, a self-calling function, which basically invokes as soon as the page loads. So load PayPal button. So now if I reload the page, we should see that right here. So now it's time to actually load the button. So here, this PayPal JavaScript SDK gives us a global PayPal object, which we can use to load the PayPal button. So here's the global PayPal object, which is given to us by this SDK right here. And we use that to initialize a PayPal button and then load it onto the page. So that's using the buttons API call. And then the buttons API call takes a style argument, which has a couple of parameters that we can use to configure the button. So we have, I'm going to use a large button here. It's going to have a horizontal layout. Color is going to be blue. The shape, we want a rectangle shape. and the label will be checkout. Okay, so here we're just configuring some visual options on the button. We then need to tell PayPal to render that button, and that's going to be using the PayPal button div tag that we set up earlier a few minutes ago in the video. So this value right here corresponds to this ID attribute right there. So now this will actually mount the button onto our page, assuming everything is properly set up. And here we have actually two buttons. Here's for people who maintain credit balances on PayPal. We don't want to use this. So we can actually tell PayPal in the JavaScript SDK, add a URL parameter and disable. We want to disable that funding source, and we want to disable the credit funding source. So that will get rid of that, and that gives us the PayPal button. So now this is how we do a simple setup on PayPal. We have the client ID loaded into the JavaScript SDK. So if we open this up and scroll to the bottom, you'll see the PayPal import with the client ID from our env variables. And here we're loading the PayPal button with some basic visual configuration, the blue and the rectangular shape and things like that. We have to add a few more configuration options here to get this to work. So this is just one big JSON file. Let's go ahead and set this up. We want to basically we have to bind two main things. We need to bind a create order function, which takes a data and actions arguments, and then we also need an approve callback. So it's on approve. And then here we have data and actions as well. So at a bare minimum, we're going to need these two callback functions, and we'll do the first one and then the second one. So the create order, what's going to happen here is we have to tell PayPal to do a post request to our server, which will return order details. So this does not actually process any orders. So it's to be very clear, this does not actually run any charges. That doesn't happen until the user actually hits OK. So we have to send a post request to our server to create an order with a price and an order ID, things like that. And then that will return to the button what the user is purchasing. So let's go ahead and do that. So in the routes folder over here, we need to create a new route. I'm going to call it order.js. Let's go ahead and just set up the basic requirements. Here we're going to set up a post request, and we want to say create. And this is where the PayPal button that we set up is going to send a request to. So right here is where we need to actually create the specific order to make this work. However, before we do that, let's go ahead to app.js and import this route. And then let's mount it onto this path right here. So /order, and then in the actual order route, it'll be /create. So I'm going to do a test handler as well for a get right here. This is just purely for testing, and we're going to return a simple JSON object. This is the order route, and let's just see if this works, just to make sure that the route is properly set up. So we have our server still running. Let's head over to localhost 3000, and then we want to do order and then create. Here it is right here. Great. So now we need to actually connect the order post handler to create a PayPal order. So this is where most of the work is done, at least for this video. So in order to do that, we need to import the PayPal server SDK. So so let's go ahead and do that right now. So it's going to be npm install --save, and then we want to do @PayPal, and then it's checkout server SDK. And this is the library, the PayPal library we're going to use to process orders on the server. So make sure you have that properly spelled. And then we're going to need this inside the order handler. So head back to order.js, and we need to import PayPal, which is the checkout library we just installed. And here we need to, this is what we use to actually create the order that this button is going to call right here. So let's go ahead and do that. So first thing I'm going to do is create a small helper method which will create the PayPal client. So that we can interact with the PayPal server. So it's a little confusing if this is your first time, but if you do it enough times, you'll get used to it. So basically what we need is we need to interact with the PayPal server, and in order to do that we need the environment variables, which is these two right here, the client ID and the client secret. So we need to grab the client ID, I'm going to use some destructuring here, and the client secret from the credentials. This is basically the env variables. And then we need to take the PayPal library, the PayPal core library, and extract the proper environment from it. So we need to get the Sandbox environment, the live production environment, and the PayPal HTTP client from the PayPal core library, like that. So here we're just destructuring a few items out of the PayPal core library, which is going to be what we use to interact with the PayPal server. And then we need to actually create the environment, the PayPal environment. If the env is dev, which is what we're going to use today, we need to create a new sandbox environment using the client ID and the client secret. If the environment is live, we instantiate a live environment like so. Okay, so hopefully that wasn't too confusing. Let me just toggle this so you can see the whole thing. So here we're creating an instance of the PayPal environment based on whether or not it's the environment is dev or production. We're only going to do dev in this video, so we're always going to be in the sandbox environment. But if you do deploy this to production, this env value will be prod, and you'll get the live environment, which will actually process real charges. So just make sure you're careful with that. And then we simply need to return a new PayPal HTTP client, and this is the actual tool. This is the actual client tool that we use to interface with the PayPal SDK, so or the PayPal server. So here's how we actually interact with the PayPal server. So hopefully that makes sense. But basically, what we're doing here in this helper method is grabbing the PayPal environment that we need to interact with the PayPal server. So now on the actual create, what we do next is we have to create a request, and that's done through the PayPal orders API, and that's orders create request. So here we're creating an order, a PayPal order. And again, we're not actually processing the order here. This is important to remember that we're not actually running any charges. A charge doesn't happen until the user authorizes the charge. So this just creates the order without actually processing any payment. And we have to do a couple small configuration options here. Don't worry too much about what this means. It's not too important for this video. And then here we tell it we just want to capture the order. And then we want to tell, here's where we tell PayPal the key information about the order. So here's where we tell the amount, and that's going to be currency code. Obviously, if you're doing a different country, just make sure you use your currency code. And then the value I'm going to say is, for now, I'm just going to say it's $5, 5 USD. So here is where the most important stuff happens, is where we tell PayPal the amount of the actual order. And again, just to be very clear, we're not actually processing an order here. We're not charging anyone. We're just creating the order. So let's go ahead and actually finish that out. So we want to do a try catch here. We need to create a credentials object where we pass in the client ID, and this is going to be from the environment variables. So that's going to be from this right here. So we need the client ID and then the client secret. This is client secret. So we have our credentials object right here, and then here we have to actually create the order. We're going to use async await. So go back up to the top and add an async prefix here, and then right here we're going to do await, and then we tell the PayPal client, we instantiate a PayPal client using the credentials, and we pass in the dev. And be aware that this is, we're using this right here. So we pass in the credentials, and we told it to be, it's going to be the dev environment, so that it passes us the sandbox back, right? And then this is going to give us an object that can directly interface with PayPal. So we can just tell it to execute the request, this request right here, like that. Actually, I'm going to just change this back. Execute this request, and this is the async call. This is an asynchronous operation. So when that's done, it will create the order, and then we can send back a JSON object with an order ID, and then that's going to be the order, and then the result, and then the ID. And that should be good enough for creating the order. However, we should do a error handling just to be safe. Okay, so That was a bit much. Hopefully you caught all that. But before I go back and explain some of this, let me run the code on the client side and make sure nothing broke on the client side. Okay, so now the PayPal button is loaded. Now it's important to understand that this order API endpoint that we created here will not be called until we actually click the button. But don't forget, we didn't tell PayPal to call that endpoint yet. So as far as PayPal is concerned, this doesn't exist, right? So we have to tell it to call our endpoint so that it can get the order from our server. So here we're going to use fetch for that because fetch is built in to most browsers these days. So here we're going to tell it to actually go to the order endpoint and then the create that we just set up. So this is on our server. It's very important to understand that. And then we have to pass in some configuration options here. This is a fetch API and it's going to be a post. We have to pass in some headers. It's going to be content type. It's going to be application JSON. And then we pass in, actually we don't need to pass in any body here. We can just leave that alone. So that should be good for that. And then you tell it on the callback, there's going to be a response. And the way fetch works is you have to convert the response into JSON, and then that will be the final response. And then here we tell PayPal what the order ID is. So this is the order ID, like so, that we're passing in, or that we're returning right there. So that's where the two come together. And this order ID then gets binded to the button, which then knows what to load on the prompt when the user clicks the PayPal button. So let's go ahead and test this. Server is still running. I'm going to reload the page. Let's go ahead and close this out. And let's see what we get. Oh, we got an error here. Let's see. Expected an order ID to be passed. So let's see what we got here. We got the order create right there. There's the post request, right? So went to our order create, and we have it right here. And let's see the order ID. And right here, I made a typo. You see that? There's no period. So my client ID didn't get passed through to the credentials. So the whole thing failed because my client ID was not successfully passed through. So there's definitely that would cause a mistake. Let's make sure I didn't make any other mistakes, which is certainly possible. So we have our Sandbox live PayPal client. There's the core. Grab the environment. Okay. Order result ID. Looks good, looks good, looks good. Okay, let's try that. So now we reload and hit the PayPal order endpoint. And now notice how it's asking us to sign in to PayPal, but look at the URL. This is a Sandbox account. So what this tells you is that we're not actually hitting the live API or the live website. This is a Sandbox website. So I'm going to grab this. I'm going to grab one of my fake accounts in Sandbox right here. So this is one of my fake buyer accounts, and I'm going to go back and log in to the fake buyer account. And notice here this is $5, and this is a fake person, fake everything. This is $5 over here, and that's based on the value I passed in here. So let's say I want to make that $6, right? I can change that to 6 and then go back. I'm going to cancel this transaction, and then I'm going to reload the page and do it again. And now this is $6. So here's where I can go ahead and pay. I can go ahead and use a fake credit card or PayPal balance or whatever. And this is all fake because again it's on Sandbox. So this is all fake transactions. This is how you set up the actual button and the initial server flow on your end. I'm going to wrap it up here for now because this is a bit much for one video, but in the next video what we're going to do is handle the actual approval process. So at some point the visitor is going to press submit payment or pay now and hopefully actually purchase a t-shirt, and then that's going to hook into this callback right here, and over here is where we want to determine what to do on the server end when a payment is actually processed. So in the next video we're going to take care of that, actually processing payments. This video is focused on just setting everything up. Notwithstanding that one mistake, it was a pretty smooth flow. Hopefully this makes sense. The first time you do this it can be a little confusing, so I would recommend watching this video at least twice and try to do this again a couple times so you understand what's going on here. And that way you can use this for other projects if you want to set up a PayPal checkouts flow. So that'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.